When the siren blew across the Richmond shipyards, the night erupted in cheers. It was January 12th, 1943, 3:45 in the morning, and a crew of exhausted men and women had just done what the world said was impossible. A 14,000-ton Liberty ship, the S.S. Robert E. Peary, slid into the cold gray water of San Francisco Bay. For days earlier, there had been nothing but steel plates and sparks. Now, a fully built cargo ship floated under floodlights, its name painted fresh and glistening. The Germans called it propaganda. America called it Tuesday. Steam hissed from valves, horns blared, and workers waved from catwalks, their faces streaked with soot and welding dust. Reporters jostled for position near the slipway as a woman in overalls. Her name was Evelyn Hartman, 26 years old, former waitress from Iowa, held up a sign made from a piece of scrap metal. It read, "For days flat." She told a journalist from the Oakland Tribune, her voice hoarse from smoke. "We used to think ships were born, not built. Now we build one before the weekend." Behind her, hundreds of welders and fitters were still working. The factory never slept. Floodlights turned the night sky orange, cranes creaked like giant insects, and the air smelled of hot metal and oil. Sparks rained from the scaffolding, falling like fireworks over the water. The loudspeaker crackled. "Liberty ship number 440, S.S. Robert E. Peary, completed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes." Applause rolled through the shipyard like thunder. For a moment, everyone forgot the war, the rationing, the telegrams of loss. They just stared at the impossible thing they had made. In Berlin, Nazi radio commentators scoffed. American industry is chaotic. Their workers are lazy. They build toys, not ships. But deep down, the Reich's naval planners were worried. U-boats had sunk hundreds of Allied ships, and yet somehow, more kept coming. Faster, cheaper, endless. For every vessel the Germans sent to the bottom, America launched 2 more. The Richmond yards ran on shifts that blurred into each other, 3 crews rotating around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Most workers had never seen a ship before they were hired. Housewives, farmers, mechanics, teenagers. Many were women who had never touched a welding torch until last year. A supervisor once said, "We don't train welders. We train believers." The scale was staggering. 7 massive shipyards stretching along the California coast, each one a city of cranes and noise. The Kaiser shipyards employed nearly 100,000 people, producing 1 Liberty ship every 2.5 days. And yet, no one outside really understood how they did it. Even many of the workers didn't. There was no blueprint for this kind of speed. Before the war, building a cargo ship took nearly a year. Every rivet was hammered by hand. Every section assembled piece by piece. But now, the process had become something else, part science, part miracle. A welder named Joe Ramirez described it best. "You don't think. You move. You're part of the line, and the line never stops. The ship grows around you, and one day it's just alive." Every clang of metal echoed with urgency. Somewhere out in the Atlantic, convoys were being hunted. The war devoured ships faster than anyone could build them. Each new home meant food for Britain, fuel for bombers, or supplies for soldiers heading to Africa and Europe. Henry J. Kaiser, the man behind it all, wasn't a sailor or even an engineer. He was a dam builder, the mind behind Hoover Dam. When he turned his attention to ships, people laughed. "He's building dams with propellers," one naval officer joked. But Kaiser saw something others didn't. War wasn't just about bravery. It was about logistics, the simple, brutal math of steel and time. "If speed is a weapon," he said, "then we'll build faster than anyone can fight." He divided the shipbuilding process into hundreds of separate tasks, each handled like an assembly line. Instead of constructing ships from keel to deck, they built sections, giant steel modules, and welded them together like a puzzle. It was the Ford Motor Company on the sea. Still, no one could quite believe what they had achieved that January morning. The Peary wasn't a prototype or a stunt. It was proof that the laws of production had been rewritten. At the press tent, a war correspondent from Life magazine asked Kaiser's foreman how it felt. The man wiped his hands on a rag and said quietly, "Feels like we outran the war for a minute." The crowd laughed, but the word stuck. Because behind the applause Behind the patriotic headlines and the music blaring from the loudspeakers, there was a secret, something even the engineers didn't want to say aloud. The pier had been built too fast. Welded seams where there should have been rivets. Shortcuts hidden under paint. Corners bent under the weight of impossible deadlines. But for now, no one cared. The ship floated. It gleamed. It was a miracle of fire and iron. Proof that America could build the future overnight. The workers filed out at dawn, faces glowing orange in the light of torches still burning. Someone shouted, "We'll build another one in 3 days." The foreman smiled, but said nothing. Because he knew what no one else did. When you build at this speed, something always breaks. By sunrise, the pier was already steaming out of the bay. And in its wake, a new question began to rise with the smoke. How fast can you build a miracle before it starts to crack? Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They didn't hammer. They didn't rivet. They welded, and in 1942, that was madness. Before the war, ships were built the way they'd always been built, by men with hammers and sweat and time. Each plate bolted by hand, each seam sealed with molten rivets. It was slow, but it worked. Rivets flexed, they gave the ship life. Welding, on the other hand, was considered dangerous, brittle, unpredictable, too modern for the sea. But Henry J. Kaiser didn't care about tradition. He cared about time. When Kaiser was asked how he expected to outbuild the Germans, he said simply, "If we can pour concrete for a dam in the desert, we can weld steel by the ocean." He wasn't a naval man. He had built the Hoover and Grand Coulee dams, monuments of rock and rebar, not propellers and hulls. But what he understood was systems. And what he saw in the war was a system too slow to survive. The British were losing ships faster than they could replace them. An average of 1 Liberty ship sunk every day in the Atlantic. U-boats were tearing the supply lines apart. The Allies didn't need craftsmanship, they needed speed. So Kaiser took a principle from Detroit, modular assembly, and dragged it into the shipyards. Instead of building one vessel from the keel up, he divided it into more than 200 prefabricated sections. Bow, stern, midships, deckhouse, funnel. Each built separately, welded, then joined like an enormous puzzle. To traditional shipbuilders, it was heresy. Old foremen muttered that welding was too clean. One veteran from the East Coast yard sneered, "You can't weld a ship. It'll crack the first time it hits cold water." But Kaiser ignored them. He brought in automobile engineers, dam workers, and a handful of metallurgists. He said, "We'll build ships like cars. The sea will have to adjust." The Richmond yards became a laboratory. The smell of flux filled the air. Sparks fell like orange rain. They built jigs to hold the modules in place, rotating the steel sections on cranes so that welders could work faster. Each seam was a line of light, the hiss of molten metal like music. A journalist described the yard as a cathedral of fire. Evelyn Hartman, the same woman who'd cheered at the launch of the Peary, was now a lead welder. She wore thick gloves that swallowed her hands and a helmet that made her look like a soldier. "It's not pretty work," she said, "but it feels like fighting." And she wasn't alone. By 1943, nearly a quarter of all workers in Kaiser's shipyards were women. Some came straight from farms or offices, some from schools. Many had never used a tool in their lives. But under the glare of the arc light, they became part of a rhythm faster than thought. Fitting, cutting, welding, grinding. A foreman once timed Evelyn, 3 feet of perfect weld in 30 seconds. He called her lightning. The speed was astonishing. A ship that once took 300 days now took 30. And when they broke their own record with the Peary, Kaiser told his staff, "Next time, we'll do it in 3. The secret wasn't just welding, it was belief. The belief that war could be won by discipline and design, not just courage. Still, not everyone was convinced. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships warned that welded hulls might not flex in rough seas. Some engineers predicted the seams would split like glass. But Kaiser's yards kept producing faster and faster. The Navy needed tonnage, and tonnage didn't wait for perfection. In Washington, officials debated whether to slow production for safety checks. Kaiser sent them a telegram that read simply, "We can't win the war by second-guessing the future." And he was right, for a while. The first welded ships rolled out and crossed the Atlantic without trouble. Sailors praised their clean lines and smoother handling. American newspapers hailed the miracle method. Photos showed welders standing on finished decks, their faces lit by sparks, their shadows stretching across the steel like ghosts. For a brief moment, America believed it had conquered time itself. At a ceremony that spring, Kaiser stood before a new ship and declared, "We will build them faster than the enemy can sink them. And when we run out of docks, we'll build docks on top of docks." The crowd laughed and cheered. It sounded like victory. But beneath the optimism, something was wrong. Some of the engineers began noticing small fractures, hairline cracks along welded joints. Nothing dramatic, just faint white lines that shimmered under the inspection lights. When the reports reached headquarters, a senior naval architect dismissed them. "It's superficial. Paint over it." And they did. They painted over the cracks, over the doubts, over the warnings. Because the war demanded motion, and motion left no time for fear. By late 1942, America had produced more ships than Germany could sink. Convoys grew thicker, losses shrank, and the Atlantic began to turn from gray to blue. The newspapers called it the Kaiser miracle. But in the frozen seas of the North Atlantic, where Liberty's ships faced storms and icebergs, the steel would soon tell a different story. One cold morning, a radio operator on convoy duty sent a message back to Richmond. "Hull fracture along midsection. Request instructions." There was no answer. Because no one knew yet. The very innovation that made America's fleet unstoppable was about to turn against it. And the first cracks in the miracle had already begun to spread. The first ships that came back from the North Atlantic told the truth no one wanted to hear. They had cracks, long, jagged scars splitting their steel skins apart. It started with whispers in shipyards. A Liberty broke in half near Iceland. Another lost her stern off Newfoundland. Engineers called it impossible. Welded seams weren't supposed to fail like that. Yet they did, under the kind of cold that made steel scream. Winter, 1943. The Atlantic was a graveyard of gray waves and invisible killers. U-boats hunted beneath the surface, but now the danger was also inside the ships themselves. In one report, the S.S. John P. Gaines was steaming through rough seas when a thunderclap tore her open. No explosion, no torpedo, just the sound of steel snapping like dry ice. The ship folded in two and sank in minutes. Only a few survived. The Navy called it brittle fracture. The press called it the ship that broke herself. In Richmond, the news spread through the night shifts. Welders stared at the headlines, silent. Evelyn Hartman didn't believe it. "It's the ocean lying," she said, trying to laugh. But when another Liberty came limping into San Francisco Bay, its deck twisted like a ribbon, no one laughed anymore. The problem was speed. Welding made ships faster to build, but the steel used in wartime production wasn't designed for Arctic cold. Riveted joints could bend and stretch, welded seams could not. They cracked clean through, running like lightning bolts across the hull. The irony was cruel. The miracle of mass production had created ships too perfect, too rigid. In their strength lay their weakness. One of Kaiser's engineers wrote in his notebook, "We are learning that even steel must be allowed to breathe." Meetings turned into arguments. The Navy wanted answers, and Kaiser's yards had none. Some blamed poor metal. Others blamed inexperience. Many of the welders were still teenagers or housewives, learning by doing. "You can't teach instinct," one foreman said. "You only learn it after something breaks." For the first time since the war began, Kaiser looked tired. He walked the catwalks of yard number 3 in silence, watching sparks fall from the welders below. Every ship leaving port carried a question he couldn't answer. Would it hold? The engineers ran tests through the night, freezing samples of steel, bending them under pressure, examining fractures under microscopes. One metallurgist described it as listening to metal die. They discovered the cracks started not where the welds were weak, but where they were too strong. The hardness made them brittle, and once a fracture began, it raced through the hull at the speed of sound. In one report, the Navy described how a deck split cleanly from bow to stern, as if cut by an invisible saw. The press wanted someone to blame. Congress asked for an investigation, but Kaiser refused to slow production. He told his managers, "We'll fix the ships while we're still building them." And they tried. They changed the steel composition, adjusted the weld angles, redesigned the frames. They called in women from the night shifts to help test new alloys, their hands steady, their eyes sharper than the men's. Evelyn worked 12 hours straight polishing samples for testing. When one didn't crack, she wrote in chalk on the metal, "Hold fast." By February 1943, the yards were working under quiet panic. Every launch was both celebration and gamble. Welders touched the hulls before they left dock, like priests blessing soldiers before battle. Then came the order no one expected. A convoy of 10 new Liberty ships was to sail within 4 days. They hadn't finished all the reinforcements. "If we delay," a Navy officer warned, "men will die waiting for supplies." Kaiser looked at the clock. "For days," he said. "We'll make it work." In those 4 days, the shipyards became something between a factory and a prayer. The sound of torches filled the night, mixed with the distant moan of foghorns. The workers knew, if these ships failed, the miracle of mass production would die with them. When the first of the convoy, the S.S. John Erickson, slipped into the water, no one cheered. They just watched in silence, waiting to see if the seams would hold. The hull groaned once, twice, then steadied. A small ripple of applause broke out. Evelyn exhaled for the first time in minutes. Kaiser turned away, his jaw tight. The ships were moving again. But under the noise of engines and steel, a deeper question lingered, one no one dared to ask aloud. How many miracles could you weld before one of them broke in half? When the men went to war, the women picked up the torches. And in their hands, America's fleet began to glow. By the spring of 1943, the Kaiser shipyards no longer sounded like the world of men. The laughter was higher, the voices sharper, the rhythms somehow faster. The war had emptied towns and factories of their sons, and so the daughters came, thousands of them, wearing denim coveralls and steel-capped boots 2 sizes too big. They were farmers' wives, teachers, waitresses, secretaries. Many had never seen the ocean before, but after 3 weeks of training, they could fuse steel as cleanly as any veteran. The posters called them Rosie the Riveter, but most of them weren't riveting. They were welding, building the skin of the Liberty ships, one molten seam at a time. The numbers were staggering. By late 1943, over 200,000 women worked in American shipyards. Nearly half of Kaiser's welders were female. "If the boys can fight in snow," said Helen O'Brien, a 21-year-old from Oregon, "I can burn in sparks." On her first day, Helen's sleeve caught fire. She didn't flinch. She just stomped it out and kept working. Her instructor, an old shipwright from Brooklyn, shook his head in disbelief. "Lady," he muttered, "you just passed your test." At night, the shipyards looked like constellations fallen to earth. Thousands of torches flaring under the cranes, their blue light reflecting off the water. From a hill above Richmond, you could see the glow miles away. Locals called it the fire of the home front. Inside the yards, the tempo was unlike anything America had seen. Whole sections of ships rolled out of warehouses every few hours. Bow plates, deckhouses, bulkheads. Women carried them on overhead cranes, locked them into place, and sealed them with a hiss of light. Sparks danced in their hair. The smell of burning flux filled the air, mixed with coffee, machine oil, and the distant whistle of trains bringing more steel. They competed with the men, not out of spite, but pride. A sign above Bay 3 read, "Fastest seam wins a case of Coke." By noon, the women usually won. Their welds were thinner, smoother, more precise. An engineer said, half joking, "They don't muscle it, they listen to it." Helen's partner, a woman named Ruth Delgado, kept a notebook in her locker. On one page, in pencil, she wrote, "Every line we weld is a promise. Somewhere, a sailor will live because of it." The men returning from the front were stunned. They expected chaos. Instead, they found perfection. The once brittle seams that had cracked in the cold Atlantic were now flawless. The women's hands were steadier. Their welds absorbed stress instead of shattering under it. Metallurgists confirmed what the yard already knew. The human touch had saved the machine. By autumn, the change was undeniable. Ship after ship launched without incident. The John Erickson, the Nathaniel Bacon, the Samuel Chase, all welded by crews of women. The cracks that had haunted Kaiser's engineers were gone. But it wasn't just about ships. It was about identity. For the first time, women were no longer helping the war, they were building it. When the night shift ended, many stayed to watch the launches. They'd lean on the railings, faces glowing from the torchlight, as another gray hull slid into the bay. One woman whispered, "There she goes, a piece of us, heading to war." The transformation spread beyond Richmond. In Portland, Baltimore, Mobile, every major shipyard glowed with the same strange beauty: fire against water, light against darkness. America's coastline had become a living forge. Even the government noticed. Newsreels showed women in helmets, sparks flying, music swelling beneath the narrator's voice. These are the hands that build the ships that carry freedom across the sea. For Helen, the job became personal. Her brother was somewhere in the Pacific on a Liberty ship. She didn't know which one. So she welded every seam as if it might be his. She worked 12-hour shifts, slept 4 hours, then came back. "I'm not tired," she said when asked. "I'm just cooling off." Christmas Eve, 1943. Snow drifted over the bay. The night shift kept working, torches flaring like candles. Helen paused only once, wiping her face with a rag, and looked across the rows of women welding in silence. "We're not building ships," she murmured. "We're building a way home." By winter, the miracle was complete. The welds no longer cracked. The hulls no longer split. The shipyards, once symbols of panic, became factories of rhythm and precision. The Liberty ships began to roll out of Richmond again, one every day, gleaming under the California sun. And somewhere deep in the steel, beneath the noise and the fire, you could still feel it, the pulse of 1,000 hands holding the torches steady. By winter, the cracks were gone, and the ships started flying off the docks again. Detroit had the car line. Richmond built the ship line. By 1944, the Kaiser shipyards were no longer just factories. They were an idea made visible, a vast choreography of steel, light, and speed. Reporters who visited called it the city that never sleeps, because the ocean can't wait. The air throbbed with the sound of cranes, diesel engines, and the shrill hiss of welders' torches. At night, the shipyard glowed brighter than downtown San Francisco. The principle was simple: build a ship the way Detroit built a car. No more custom work, no slow craftsmanship. Every Liberty ship was identical: 441 feet long, 56 feet wide, 10,800 tons of steel, 250,000 parts. Every bolt, every beam, every hatch had a number, a place, and a purpose. The yards were divided into zones. Zone A built bows. Zone B, midsections. Zone C, sterns. Each zone had its own crews, its own clock, its own whistle. The pieces came together on an assembly slipway that stretched half a mile toward the water. They called it the line. It was industrial poetry. Trains delivered prefabricated plates every hour. Cranes lifted them like puzzle pieces, lowering each segment into place with the precision of a watchmaker. Thousands of workers swarmed the decks: welders, painters, electricians, pipe fitters, moving in perfect rhythm. From above, the scene looked alive, like veins of fire running through a metallic heart. An engineer named Frank Mitchell once said, "It looked like we were building skyscrapers sideways." And it was true. Liberty ships didn't rise, they stretched. Every day, a new hull slid from the line into the bay. Every launch was a small victory, every splash a note in a larger song. When the hull hit the water, workers cheered, brass bands played, flags waved. A bell, the victory bell, rang for each launch. By the end of the war, that bell would sound 2,710 times. Kaiser's management had perfected what they called the rhythm. No idle hours, no wasted motion. If one crew finished early, they moved to the next ship. Schedules were printed with military precision, 12-hour shifts, overlapping by 30 minutes so the work never stopped. Ships were built not one by one, but in parallel, dozens under construction at once. There was no time for names. Until launch day, every vessel was known only by a number. On one gray morning, Helen O'Brien stood on the scaffolding of hull 1689, welding the seams where the bow met the deck. Below her, sparks rained over a sign that read, "One ship a day keeps Hitler away." By noon, the hull was complete. By night, the cranes were already fitting the next one. The yard clock struck midnight. Somewhere in the distance, the victory bell rang again. To outsiders, it seemed impossible. To the workers, it had become normal. The assembly line that once produced 300 cars a day now produced a 14,000-ton ship every 24 hours. Each one capable of crossing the Atlantic, carrying 9,000 tons of cargo, 2,840 jeeps, or 300,000 artillery shells. The line never rested. Even Christmas was just another shift. You couldn't tell the holidays from the weekdays, Helen remembered later. The torches burned the same. The press adored it. Newsreels showed Liberty ships sliding into the water, with swing music in the background and cheerful narrators announcing. Every day, a new Liberty set sail, a floating promise from the home front to the front line. But beneath the celebration, there was something unsettling, the sheer relentlessness of it all. The workers called themselves the sleepwalkers. They ate standing up, slept in their overalls, dreamed of weld seams and blueprints. One man said, "When you close your eyes, you still hear the hammer." Speed became both a point of pride and a kind of fever. Kaiser's motto, "Faster still," was painted on every wall. When a record was broken, it wasn't celebrated. It became the new baseline. On February 8, 1944, the shipyard hit its peak. One complete Liberty ship every day for 30 days straight. The newspapers called it America's Steel March. But there was no applause in the yards that night. Just silence, exhaustion, and the echo of boots on concrete. One welder fainted mid-shift. Another kept working after slicing her hand open. The doctor's tent overflowed with coughs and burns. The sea, meanwhile, waited. The Atlantic still swallowed ships, faster than ever. The U-boats adapted, learned the convoy's routes, hunted by night. The Liberty ships were strong, but they weren't invincible. Some made it through. Others didn't. When a ship was lost, the yard posted its name on a board near the gate. The next morning, someone would chalk over it. Replace in 5 days. The machine never stopped. One night, as Helen finished her shift, she heard the faint clang of the victory bell again. Another ship was ready. The sound rolled through the fog, deep and hollow. She looked toward the bay and saw the new hull sliding into the dark water, torches flaring like stars along its side. For a moment, she wondered, how many of these steel giants would ever come home? Then she picked up her helmet, wiped the soot from her face, and went back to work. But while America built ships faster than ever, the ocean was still swallowing them. In 1943 alone, the Atlantic claimed 226 Liberty ships. The shipyards didn't just fight deadlines, they fought death itself. From the moment the first Liberty left Richmond's docks, the ocean became its second battlefield. U-boats waited like wolves beneath the waves, their periscopes glinting just below the gray surface. Convoys stretched for miles, hundreds of ships crawling across the Atlantic under a sky that never seemed to change. Each ship carried life and steel, tanks, rations, fuel, munitions, everything the Allies needed to stay alive. But every crossing felt like a coin toss. A Navy report from January 1943 described the S.S. Nathaniel Bacon going down in 6 minutes after 2 torpedoes struck midship. The captain's last radio call was half static, half prayer. "We can see the torpedoes coming. 2-3. God help us." By dawn, she was gone. In Richmond, her name appeared on the blackboard by the main gate. Lost at sea, replace in 5 days. The workers read it in silence. No speeches, no memorials. Someone erased the name, and the next ship on the line took its place. The message was clear. Grief had no time slot on the schedule. Henry Kaiser visited the yards that same week. He looked older now, gray under the helmet, the sleeplessness of war visible in his eyes. "Every ship we lose," he told his foreman, "costs 1,000 lives we'll never see. So we build faster than they can sink." That became the new slogan, "Build faster than they sink." It was printed on posters, lunchroom walls, pay stubs. It became a prayer whispered between shifts. The pace was merciless. Every lost ship meant more convoys to replace it, more steel, more hands, more heat. The women in Bay 2 began working 16-hour days. Helen O'Brien barely remembered what sleep felt like. She wrote in her notebook, "If we stop, someone dies." Meanwhile, out on the ocean, the war turned mechanical. Radar pings replaced voices. Explosions replaced silence. Men froze in lifeboats waiting for rescue ships that would never come. Yet every few days, new Liberty ships appeared on the horizon. Fresh, identical, unstoppable. A British sailor called them the Ghost Fleet. because no matter how many were sunk, more kept coming. It's like fighting the tide, he said. Inside the shipyards, the mood swung between exhaustion and defiance. Welders taped photos of lost ships to their lockers. Bacon, Gaines, George Calvert, names that had become legends of both failure and endurance. When one sank, someone would write on the photo in chalk, "She died doing her job." To the workers, each launch became an act of resistance. They weren't just making ships, they were keeping the line of life open across an ocean that wanted to close it. The Navy began to send back fragments from wrecks that were recovered, twisted hull plates, burned rivets, blackened lifebuoys. Kaiser's engineers studied them like detectives, searching for weaknesses, redesigning, improving. Every loss made the next ship stronger. At night, the welders could hear the foghorns from the bay, low and mournful, like the sound of the dead calling home. One welder, a quiet man named Joseph Dunn, said, "Every sound out there is a ship asking us not to stop." Then, in the spring of 1944, the rhythm reached its breaking point. An explosion ripped through Yard 2. A spark had ignited a fuel line. 3 workers died instantly. The blast blew out windows for a mile. For a few minutes, everything went silent. The next morning, all shifts reported as usual. No one said a word. The cranes began to move again at dawn. Helen later said it was the moment she understood what the war had turned them into, soldiers without rifles, fighting with flame and steel. The front line wasn't only in Normandy or the Pacific. It was here, in the roar of furnaces, the shimmer of welding arcs, the pounding of hammers echoing through the night. For every Liberty ship that sank, 2 more were already half-built. The shipyards had become America's heartbeat, pulsing faster than fear itself. By summer, the statistics told a story stranger than fiction. In 1 month, the U-boats sank 70 ships, but 140 new Liberties were launched. For every explosion at sea, another hull touched water somewhere along the Pacific coast. A Japanese admiral, captured in 1945, would later say in interrogation, "We could sink them. We could not stop them. It was like fighting a factory that floated." One night, Helen stood by the edge of the pier as another Liberty slid into the dark water. She felt the ground shake beneath her feet, saw the sparks scatter like fireflies, and whispered to no one in particular, "Go fast, go far, and don't break." The next day, a telegram came to the yard, another ship lost. The board by the gate changed again. New name. Same words. Lost at sea, replace in 5 days. The workers didn't flinch. They just turned on their torches. The blue flames roared back to life. The war machine breathed again. For the builders of Richmond, the battlefield was measured not in miles, but in hours. For every ship that sank, 2 more were born. And somewhere in the Pacific, a Japanese admiral whispered, "We can't sink them fast enough." By 1945, America wasn't just winning the war. It was manufacturing victory. Across the country, the shipyards that once began as experiments now beat like the arteries of a living nation. Richmond, Portland, Baltimore, Mobile, all of them ran day and night, fire and steel never resting. The Kaiser yards alone had launched more than 1,400 Liberty ships. Nationally, the total would reach 2,710, more ships than the rest of the world combined. They called it the speed of democracy. Each morning, headlines read like poetry made of numbers: 2 ships a day, 3 tomorrow. Workers no longer cheered at launches. They simply nodded, wiped the sweat from their faces, and went back to their torches. Production had become faith. The yards that once looked chaotic now ran with clockwork precision. Cargo hulls, oilers, troop transports, everything built from the same blueprint, welded from the same discipline. There was no downtime, no pause for celebration. Even after the news of D-Day, the torches burned on. Helen O'Brien wrote in her notebook, "We cheered for Normandy, then welded for Okinawa." Each ship carried the rhythm of a continent. Farmhands from Iowa, miners from Kentucky, women from California, all of them had fingerprints in the steel. The welds of strangers met like handshakes frozen in metal. By the spring of 45, the line between the front and the factory had dissolved completely. When the soldiers moved forward, the factories followed, in spirit and in pace. A journalist visiting Richmond described it as an army without uniforms, fighting an enemy called time. Even the air smelled different. Salt, diesel, ozone, coffee. The clang of hammers blended with the horns of departing ships, a metallic hymn that never stopped. Some workers said they could feel the war ending just by the sound. The way the waves seemed to echo back slower, calmer. Then, one morning, it did end. May 8th, 1945. V-Day. When the announcement came over the loudspeakers, the torches went out one by one. For the first time in years, the shipyards fell silent. The workers looked at each other, unsure whether to cheer or cry. Some laughed. Some prayed. Some simply sat down, hands trembling, unsure what to do without the vibration of the ground beneath them. Helen stood on the dry dock, helmet under her arm, and looked out at the bay. Hundreds of Liberty ships floated there, gray, massive, patient. They had outlived the war they were built for. "We made more than the world could sink," she whispered. A week later, the last Liberty ship left Richmond. Its name, S.S. Albert M. Bow. It carried supplies to the Pacific, where the fighting still burned. Then came Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and finally, silence across both oceans. When Japan surrendered in August, the shipyards didn't erupt in celebration. They exhaled. The cranes stopped swinging. The welders set down their torches. After 4 years of constant motion, America stood still. The workers drifted away. Some went home to families, others to new jobs. A few stayed on to dismantle the machines that had made history. The glow of the torches faded. The fire on the waterfront dimmed until only the sea reflected the stars again. One night, Helen returned to the docks alone. The victory bell, once rung for every launch, hung silent, covered in dust and rust. She touched it with her glove and smiled faintly. "You did your job," she said. The next day, the government officially shut down the Kaiser yards. They'd done what no one thought possible, built an ocean's worth of ships in less than 4 years. Historians would later call it the industrial miracle. But for those who lived it, it was simpler: exhaustion, pride, and disbelief. Reporters came to photograph the last workers leaving the gates. One of them asked Helen, "Do you think they'll remember what you did here?" She shrugged. "Doesn't matter if they remember. The ships will." Years later, a faded sign still stood over the main entrance. For days, 14,000 tons. One nation. The bell was gone. The docks were quiet. But the world those workers had built, the factories, the speed, the confidence, remained. America had learned to do the impossible not by dreaming, but by doing. The Liberty ships carried that lesson across the oceans. Some became cargo vessels. Some rusted away in foreign harbors. A few still float today, relics of an age when ordinary people turned steel into hope. Helen O'Brien never went back to welding. She married, raised 2 children, and kept her torch in a box in the attic. On the handle, still etched into the steel, were the words stamped by Kaiser's engineers in 1942, "Built for Liberty." Sometimes, when she told her grandchildren about the war, they'd ask what it felt like: the noise, the heat, the speed. She'd think for a moment and say, "It felt like the whole country was awake at once." And then she'd pause, smile softly, and add, "They said it was impossible to build a ship in 4 days." America didn't argue. It just did it.